My name is Melanie Kincaid. I am the Director of Communications and Development here at Historic London Town and Gardens. Thank you so much for coming tonight. How did everyone hear about this lecture tonight? Was it through who heard from our e-blast? Any local listings about it? Chesapeake Crossroads? Oh, fantastic. Any other ways that you found? Maybe social media?
I saw it on Facebook.
Facebook? Okay. And yes, he's married to me. I didn't know what he was gonna say, so I had to give him that option. But thank you so much. This lecture tonight is made possible through funding from Chesapeake Crossroads Heritage Area. We had a previous lecturer, Nastasia Parker came and she portrayed Ona Judge. We have Chris Haley here tonight with us. And then we will have two additional lectures, one on Maryland's Emancipation Day with Joseph Feaster. He's going to be portraying a United States Colored Troops chaplain, which there are only 14 in the United States at the time. And he's going to be talking about what emancipation means to him and also his troops. And then in mid-November, we're going to have Reverend Lawrence Walker come. He's going to be talking about his journey through making the descendant community in Mount Peliar, and just also another amazing lecture as well. So Chris Haley, I'm going to read a bio because you've just done so much, and I've seen you speak one time before, and I know many of you have come and listened to him in previous lectures as well. So Chris Haley, he's an actor, a writer, a filmmaker, and director of research, education, and outreach, and the Legacy of Slavery program in Maryland at the Maryland State Archives and the Utopia Film Festival. He's thrilled to link the two main pursuits of his life together, which is history and the arts. He is the co-director of the Capital Region Emmy-nominated documentary, Unmarked, on the state of often unknown and under-supported burial sites of free and enslaved African Americans. He was named the 2021 Anne Arundel County Arts Council Literary Arts Award recipient for his many writings, including the poetry collections Until the Right One Comes Along, Obsessions, Fists and Rainbows, and Your Buddy. He is currently the narrator and host of the podcast, The People's Recorder, produced by Spark Media on the 1930s Federal Writers Project. He is the 2024 Society of American Archivists Diversity Award and the American Association of State and Local History Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, and the 2023 National Park Service Network to Freedom Robert G. Stanton and Wilbur H. Seibert Award recipient. He founded the Underground Railroad Legacy of Slavery Research Program at the Maryland State Archives in 2021. The project has produced online access to over 400,000 entries related to the lives of free and enslaved African Americans who lived there before, during, and after the Civil War. It's my pleasure to bring Chris Haley to the stage here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Melanie. You know, when you look at your biography sometimes, it doesn't seem that long. And then when someone reads it, you're like, oh my gosh, I should have cut that out. I should have cut that out because now my hour's up. It's like, what can I do now? Thank you all for being here. Some of my most pleasant moments as a speaker, as a historian, I feel like I have shared at London Town. I've been at the Maryland State Archives for 30 years. I think, it was December of 1993 I started there. And I'll tell you the backstory. I thought I was going to be there maybe a year because I was so geared up that I was going to go to California and pursue my career in the arts. I went to the archives because there was a job freeze at the Library of Congress. There was a job freeze, I think it was a different term for it, at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives. So I couldn't go there, and my father knew Phoebe Jacobson, who helped my Uncle Alex do his research, and he said, she has it in with the State Archivist, Everett C. Pappenfuss, and the rest, as they say, is history. my whole goal in going there was to try to find out what are the authentic, verifiable, one could say certifiable, ways to study history and to study biographical facts about people which are just true. Because I wanted to do stories. I wanted to do stories about Sam Cooke, Marvin Gaye, Jackie Wilson, and I wanted to do it the right way so that somebody wouldn't be able to say, "Oh, here's Sam Cooke's birth certificate in Washington D.C." and me not knowing that, well, he wasn't born in Washington D.C. Why would he have a birth certificate there? Because I just would accept what people said. So that's what brought me on this path. And among those different presentations I've done here, one was on slavery and race, the non-PC topic. It was in this room. There were about 30 people here. They were teachers, they were social scientists, and we were just talking about how challenging it is to talk about this topic, especially when you're trying to talk about it to children and you want them to be informed but not traumatized by how harsh that situation was, but you also know it's a part of American history, so you want to share it. So that I've shared here. There was another, I think it was a week-long presentation we had, which is about the colonial era, where we had different aspects of all of London town were used as facilities, which were, I'd say, living reenactment exhibits, which were presented here. And I was so thrilled to be there for that. And I also was a member of the London Town Board, I think in the late 2010s or something like that. And I always remember it was so early in my career that I thought, oh my gosh, I've done enough that somebody's asking me to be on their board. Wow, I've really achieved something. And the dinners were really good. So with that said, we're going to talk today about, and this is just an overview, there's so much to know, so much to learn. And what I try to do whenever I give a presentation such as this is to base as much as possible what I present to you on materials that I found in an archivally sound repository, such as the Maryland State Archive or something akin to it, so that you could leave here, and if you want to find out more, you can go to the source that I mentioned to you today and find out more. Or if you talk to somebody else about this, you can, again, go to that source and find out more. In difference to me saying, I read this somewhere and I heard this somewhere, or there's this person who has a post on LinkedIn or Facebook, and I really believe what they say. No, these are really, as much as possible, I've tried to support what I say with the actual records. And so many of these images are records that are shown at the Maryland State Archives or somewhere where you can actually see this image, in difference to just because Chris Haley showed it on the screen today. So what we're going to get into today is basically the differences and the similarities between indentured servitude and slavery. One of the reasons I thought this was very important was because I think at times when people want to discuss a challenging topic, they want to conflate it with other challenging issues. And so it can diminish the gravity of what one situation is in comparison to another situation. And the goal should always be the truth of both situations, of those individuals who endured, who persevered, who overcame whatever situation they were in. And that's why I want to do this one, share this one with you today, which I also shared, I think, partially about a year or so ago for the Annapolis Jazz Festival. I think they were having lectures there as well. So one of the first things that I address is the simple question, was Maryland a slave state? Now, since you're here, and since I'm here, you probably are thinking like, well, duh, it must have been, because Melanie wouldn't have asked you to come here and talk about this topic. One of the other things that perhaps even in your own, whatever your different occupations are, you know what you do better than probably anybody else. There's probably things that you use as acronyms or abbreviations that you in your field are second nature. And someone else is like, what? What do you mean by that? I don't understand it at all. I have a doctor that I go to about annually, as many of us do when we start getting gray hair, who is a gastroenterologist. I think I said that right. Now he's from, I don't know, he might be from Pakistan, he might be from India. And anyway, I told him my title, because he says, well, what are you doing? What are you up to? What do you do? And I said, I'm the director of the legacy of slavery in Maryland. oh, there was slavery in Maryland? And this had to be no more than 2 or 3 years ago. And so I thought, well, I don't want to get us on track because we're here for a purpose. There's a goal in mind. That's why I pay my copay. Uh, but I thought, gosh, you really don't know that? You really don't know? And so that reminds me that just as we go through life and we have people that are, we look at us maybe as mentors or mentees, that we should never assume, right? We should never assume that somebody else knows what we know. And when someone is engaging you in conversation and they have a blank look on their face, it may be that whatever you said, they just don't understand it, but they're being too shy to explain it. So that's what I realized that day, that my doctor had no idea, to the degree where I was born in DC. I did not know that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were both born in the state of Maryland. We're both born on the Eastern Shore. We're both born in Talbot and Dorchester County, neighboring counties. I did not know that. And from a child, I've always been big into African American history. So that's one of the first things I tell kids when I talk to them at whichever institution it might be. And I teach about this as young as third grade, is that yes, this institution called slavery did happen in the state of Maryland. And then, of course, we just show the map, which you can find on the Maryland State Archives website if you wanted to see that. However, with that answer, there's also the reality that when Maryland was founded by the Ark and the Dove, it wasn't completely a slave state then. It was a state of indentured servitude. And that was primarily because those individuals who had the wherewithal, such as Lord Calvert, to have acreage promised to him, that the persons that he assumed the head rights for, which I'll go into more specifically in a couple of other slides, allotted him 50 acres per person who would work for him as indentured servants. And those indentured servants would help plow the field, till the soil, and just make this land more inhabitable if Lord Calvert decided to come there at some point, or if he decided to have other citizens come there on his behest. They would be a part of his property, but they were indentured servants. And those indentured servants could be of any background. They could be white, they could be black, they could be indigenous. This individual here, this is certainly not a real, we have no real image of this individual. This is Mathias de Sousa, or a reenactment of, not even a reenactment because we don't know what he really looked at, or a representation of Mathias de Sousa, who was aboard the Ark and the Dove. He is one of two persons of mixed heritage, Portuguese and African heritage, who was aboard the Ark and the Dove, and they were indentured to a Father Andrew White. This person, we have some records of him in the Maryland State Archives, in the Archives of Maryland, in the laws and proceedings, which indicate that not only was he one of the individuals who survived the voyage from England here, but also that he became a member of the General Assembly in 1642. Literally, he became a member of a General Assembly that long ago as an indentured, after his indentured servitude was complete. So I think this is one of the things I want to remind people of at the beginning, so that we know time changes. Just as we know for ourselves, time changes. 10 years ago, I didn't have gray hair. I had gray hair in that picture I had there, but you just can't see it because I had my hair cut so short. But time changes everything. So more specifically, as I said, he was an indentured servant to Father Andrew White. And I don't think we have any images of Father Andrew White, or I would have shown one. So what that meant was, for a certain amount of time, an indentured servant serves an individual. And they serve them in whichever way is dictated to them, but primarily, especially in these early times, it's mostly about agriculture. It's mostly about the land and plowing the fields, because of course at the beginning we're so much of a agricultural province is what Maryland was. And as it says specifically in the second paragraph, voyagers to the New World would receive head rights per the number of men between the ages of 16 and 50. I have not found any, not to say that I've looked at every single one, I have not found any that talk about anybody who's over the age of, say, 20 or so years of age being indentured. However, depending on your situation, your expiration date for indentured servitude, which we'll go into, could be repeated over and over again, so that certainly the end of your indentured servitude could be at a higher age than, say, we would expect someone who's indentured to have been licensed to. 50 acres to own per person that they brought over, who would, as I said, tend to the land. The individuals, and these are the terms that were used, bound or indentured in this manner would be contracted to work for the owner for a certain amount of years, after which they would be free and given some measure of acreage and tools to work the land of their own. So they wouldn't get all 50 acres, but they would be able to reach an agreement with the lord or the master that they would be given some part of that land that they toiled. And this is just some of the records that we have that are proof that Mathias de Sousa really lived. He lived along with other persons, and some of the records that we have, this is why we know anything about him. And as you could see in that first column, that's the column to my right, so it'd be your left, that third name, Matt de Sousa. So just like we think, well, what is that name? What does that name mean? There were nicknames all over. Were they considered nicknames? I don't know. But from a historical point of view, you should always be aware that however you know someone's name, just as in your own family histories, my grandmother was named Kudamama. Now my great-grandmother, that was her name, Kudamama. Her actual name was Ida Allen. But my great-grandfather said she reminded him of Little Cooter. So he called her Kudamama. I don't know how old I was before I really realized that her actual first name was Ida, and my mother was named after her. So we have Matt de Sousa, and difference to Mathias de Sousa is how we do see him in other records. So you see that where it says Matt de Sousa, and I'm trying to think if there's another person in that record that we mentioned, and I do not see one. Okay, so next slide, please. Some more records here. So here, and I know this is, now imagine we are of an age where at least we've seen cursive before. Imagine if you're talking to a third grader, fourth grader, fifth grader, sixth grader, and you're showing them this, and they're like, what the heck is that? We call it cursive, but this is like ye old cursive. So you probably can't really see it here. Now, is this, you can still hear me? So, okay. So if Mathias de Sousa, and you can't really see what that is, but that's, I think, let me look at my page if it says what I think it says. No, it just says John, so I'm not really sure what that says. But that's Mathias de Sousa, and across from that, over here, is Father Andrew White. So these are the people who were indentured to Father Andrew White, and the date 1633. This is when they're boarding the Ark and the Dove to come across on the voyage. On the other page, and I know it's just, you can't really see it. It's not even that easy to see it on this page, just so you don't feel so bad. This is Francesco, and it does say M-O-L-A-T-O, mulatto, so it lists that as well. And at the top of that counter column, this is Mathias de Sousa, mulatto, and over at the top of this column, Father Andrew White. Patent records are the original records of a property in the state of Maryland, which is to say that before someone subsequently buys something, that's a land record, that's a deed. The original owner is claiming the patent on that record, just as you claimed the patent on whoever created a microphone or created a light bulb, the patent on that land. So this is the patent for these individuals who were, at least some of these, who were indentured to Father Andrew White. And, next slide, just reiterating some of the things that we have here. Throughout the 17th century, most servants were indentured Europeans. That's our background. That's the history of Maryland, and in many other states in the United States of America, or as we would say, colonies at that time. And I do try to remind, when I am talking to kids, and sometimes adults too, because I always remind myself that even though it's saying 17th century, I want to put in parentheses 1600s, so people realize that, because sometimes your mind forgets, like we're in the 21st century, but why do I keep writing out 2024 if it's the 21st century? So I always try to remind people of that, and certainly kids too. This headright system I just talked about, as it shows right there, between 1634 and 1680, encourage settlement by promising land, usually 50 acres for each person. Why is it doing that? Well, just think in terms of where you are, even if you're very well off. If you're thinking in terms of investment, which is English, let's say English noblemen might have been doing, such as Lord Calvert, why go to this land far away where nobody is and we don't know what they have or what they don't have, except for the possibility that you might find something invaluable there. And even if you want to do that, do you want to go yourself to be that explorer when you're living probably as well as you can because you are a lord who has so many people who can work for you? You're living high on the hog. You have enough money that you can send somebody in your stead to toil the land and make it inhabitable for yourself and any others, and you can bear the fruit of your worth and of their worth. And so that's why this is set in place to get those Englishmen to want to join into this venture, almost like a venture capitalist, to explore the new world and have these individuals who also benefit from it because they will get land themselves in this new world. Isolated settlements meant less different owners, servants, and slaves worked alongside each other, which is to say, at that point, it was a mixed group of the working class. Again, blacks, indigenous, and whites. That was what the reality of the situation was then. Until, well, later, because I have another slide there. It's really until 1664. But as this was the situation, in 1661, this is the law that takes place, and it talks about when it says between 16 and 50, terms of indentured servitude. For the term or time of his or her coming in, such servants shall serve him or her that transported and pay the passage of the said servant or their assigns from and after their first arrival into this province the full term of 4 years, if between the age of 18 and 2 and 20 years. Such servant shall serve 5 years, if betwixt the age of 15 and 18. Such servant shall serve 6 years. And I think there's something missing here. I was talking to some people at work, and I thought, is there supposed to be some other years here, or am I just missing something or not understanding it? And I had 2 other persons, and we think there's just something missing because of that space there, but some other category of years that should be where it says you would serve 6 years. And any servant of what age soever under 15 years and coming in as aforesaid shall serve till he or she arrive to the age of 1 and 21 years. So 21 years of age. So as it put forth in the earlier slide, you are really term limited to your indentured servitude, after which time, as you'll see, you do have something coming to you. And this servitude was based on your age, how long you could be indentured. Are any of you lawyers here? Anyone use a lawyer? No, no, only because there's one thing is ye old English language, but also some of these things, as I read them, and after a while I start noticing a little bit more, because it's kind of hard to get through so these and where all, and this and that and the other. And that's why I thought, well, maybe I'm missing something between servant shall serve 6 years, but I think this paper is missing something. But just remember that mindset of just depending on your age, you could be indentured to a certain amount of years and not indentured to a certain amount more. And this other one is a little bit more specific about it. And also it's in transcript so you can read it better. The first line, this was the 4th point of many different points along these laws that I was looking at, but this is the one that's specific about indentured servitude. Except family members, and this one also has to do with about terminology. Most settlers transported by others, such as Francisco and Mathias, who were transported because of Father Andrew White, were bound to serve their transporters usually for 4 or 5 years. That is, they were servants, and the records are often so called. But the label servant was no stigma. In the 17th century, it had meanings different from those of today. It denoted a person of low class and menial occupation. The settlers closest to the modern idea of servants were those shipped by the dozen. They are listed sometimes as servants, sometimes as persons, and sometimes as both. And then it talks about the different patents that, such as we showed you earlier, you could find out more about how these different persons were referred in these official archival documents. Now we go further down in the middle where it says, on October 12th, when William Chaplin demanded land, Alice Bancroft was his servant, but in his patent of 18 November 1658, she was his wife's daughter. On 15 December 1669, immediately after entering rights for transporting himself and Thomasin, his wife, John Barnard assigned rights for transporting himself and, quote unquote, one servant woman. And in an assignment of 10 July 1656, the first name in the list of servants Ralph Williams brought into province is Ralph Williams, patents 5410. So there's this variable nature of how people are even referred to in the records, but it's still a part of the agreements or the arrangements or the contracts that they enter into to have to take benefit of being transported over to the Americas and to benefit from the fact that after they serve this indentured, they would be entitled to some land and some other properties, as we'll go into later. So as it says, the servant was ambiguous a term, so the status of servants was also changeable. And in some different records, which I look at, servants and slaves and Negroes was also interchangeable. Here's another slide that I found in a record about laborers in general. And you'll see here, again, going back some old English. And now through such, and now though, bless you, and now though such child hath used husbandry till his age of 12 years, yet if he be not bound as an apprentice to husbandry, and that his parents be not able to maintain him, then it seemeth that the overseers for the poor, by the affluent of the justices, might bind and apprentice such a child. So do we understand the word husbandry? Believe me, I had to look it up myself again to remind myself. Husbandry is really taking care of resources. In this case, it most often is taking care of the land, husbandry. What it's basically saying here is that if this child is so young that it is either abandoned or its children cannot take care of it, then it can be apprenticed to somebody else. And if it's apprenticed to somebody else, he or she will be used in husbandry to toil the land for whichever that individual might have that child do. And the bottom line, I want to start comparing some of the things between enslavement and between indentured servitude. If a woman who is a servant shall marry, yet she must serve out her time, and her husband cannot take her out of her master's service. So in other words, if a woman is an indentured servant to someone and she marries someone who's not an indentured servant, that does not mean that she can pull him out of indentured servitude. It means she herself has, one could say, voluntold herself to be a part of that master's employ as well, because her husband is a person who is indentured to someone else. Now we're going to get a little bit into the differences and yet the similarities. September 1664 is when the law goes into place that really indemnifies people of African descent as being enslaved forever, unless subsequently there are manumissions or wills, or within land records, they are freed. So, being enacted by the Right Honorable the Lord Proprietary by the advice and consent of the upper and lower house of the present General Assembly, that all Negroes or other slaves already within the province, and all Negroes and other slaves to be hereafter imported into the province shall serve durante vita, which means for the duration of their lives. And all children born of any Negro or other slave shall be slaves as their fathers were for the time of their lives. And as for much as diverse freeborn English women, forgetful of their free condition and to the disgrace of our nation, do intermarry with Negro slaves, by which also diverse sweets may arise touching the issue of such women, and a great damage doth befall the masters of such Negroes, for prevention whereof, for deterring such freeborn women from such, that's why I say if you're a lawyer, you can get through this quicker, from such shameful matches, be it further enacted by the authority, advice, and consent aforesaid, that whatsoever freeborn woman shall intermarry with any slave from and after the last day of this present assembly, 1664, shall serve the master of such slave during the life of her husband. So that's along the lines of what we just saw for indentured servitude, where that indentured servant, that female indentured servant, would have to serve her husband's master if he was if he was free. He would have. Is that what I said? It's the opposite of what I said. Yes, her husband cannot take her out of her service. So she could marry a free man, but she would still have to serve her indentured servitude, and he would be allied with that too. He could not break that contract that she was always into. And this is approximately the same thing for those people who were enslaved. A freeborn European woman would be virtually enslaved to her enslaved husband's master for that amount of time. And further, as far as issue, being children, and that all the issue of such freeborn women shall be slaves again as their fathers were. And be it further enacted that all issues of the English or other freeborn women that have already married Negroes, so this is what you call a grandfather clause, shall serve the masters of their parents till they be 30 years of age and no longer. So if this couple who were free and enslaved have children, those children would still be enslaved to the master of their parents for 30 years. Now, one reason why that is different and something that is worth noting is because, if you recall, I've said that in 1664, these children were enslaved as their fathers were. I think my next slide shows, well, it doesn't. The next slide is just bigger print for those of us who need that glasses. All Negroes currently in the province shall be slaves durante vita. All children born of Negro or other slaves shall be slaves as their fathers were for the term of their lives. Whatsoever freeborn woman shall intermarry with any slave from and after the last day of the present assembly shall serve the master of such slave during the life of her husband. That all issues of English or freeborn women that have already married Negroes shall serve the masters of their parents till they be 30 years of age and longer. That's what was in place in 1664, but it changes later. In 1681, you assume the status of the mother. There's a law that talks about you assume the status as your freeborn mother is, which of course also means you would assume the status as your enslaved mother was. So in that case, it doesn't matter of what the status of the father is, because you're going to be enslaved forever because that's the status of your mother. That happened in 1681. And as you see on the last line there, no Maryland law ever legislated chattel slavery for any persons other than those of African descent. Indentured servants could be any race. So that's one key difference. If at its core, you're wondering what the difference is between slavery in United States of America and the slavery and indentured servitude, it's that slavery in America was limited to those of African race. Indentured servitude could be anyone. And the next one goes a little bit more specific as to, in more modern language, what could happen? How could you find yourselves in a situation? How could your children find yourselves in the situation of being indentured? The Orphans' Court, a justice of peace, could order involuntary indentures of children falling within the following categories. So think in the terms of, if you find orphans, if you find children loitering, or if somebody has run away and maybe they don't want to say where their parents are, maybe they don't want to go home, maybe it's an abusive situation. And think about it hundreds of years ago. So if they're found, if you're brought into the local jailhouse, then the judge could decide at the Orphans' Court to put them into an indentured situation, as it says here. Orphans whose inheritance was insufficient to maintain them, illegitimate children, and children whose parents were too poor to support them. Now, specifically, as I said, this was colorblind in a way. It did not have to be for anyone of a particular race or background. However, there was a law that came up in 1808 which did specify, and that law did say provided for the indenturing of, quote, the child or children of lazy, indolent, and worthless free Negroes, end quote. Chapter 54, Laws of 1808, who could not financially support their children. Since most free blacks were denied the economic opportunities available to white children, they were constantly at risk of having their children indentured. Part of the reasons why I think this starts to come into play is because along those early years of this is the 19th century now, 1808, 19th century, is that there's been more friction and tension between the freedom that the United States of America now has because it fought this American Revolution and it won, and those persons in their backyard who work for them, who toil for them, who are also enslaved. So to some degree, in the North, they're starting to pass laws of gradual emancipation in New York, New Jersey, and there's the Quaker movement, which is starting to push more for abolition for people who are enslaved. So there's more tension and there's more of an allowance of certificates of freedom and of manumissions being granted to people of African descent. So there's also this situation where we have to keep these free blacks under control. We can't allow them to just willy-nilly be all over the country and doing this or doing that or doing what have you. So these are the type of laws that come into play to try to keep, I guess, to keep a wraps over this growing free black community. Now, checking back to what I didn't know until probably the fourth time reading this statute in 1654, not only is it very specific as to the age you are, to the term you could be contracted as an indentured servant, but also it's to the court to many times affirm what age you are. And that meant someone would have to come in and vouch for you or verify to the court what age you are so that you would apply, or what would be applied to you would be the appropriate indentured servitude. So this is 1654. Now for me, I have some of these things highlighted because I know it's so much text there. But the gist of it is, without an indenture or covenant, which means if you are coming here into the colonies and you don't already have an indentured agreement in place, if they be above the age of 20 years, shall serve 4 years, from 16 years unto 26 years, from 12 to 16 shall serve 7 years. This is in the first paragraph. And if they be under 12, they shall serve until they come to the age of 1 and 20 years. So that's really reiterating what we said before. But this is talking about if you've come here, maybe you were what is it when you're on a boat and you're not supposed to be on the boat? What do they call it? Stowaway. Okay, so you're a young stowaway and they find you and you're just there, you had to get away. So this is taking that into account, but you can't take care of yourself, so now you're going to go into indentured servitude. So in the second paragraph, all masters and owners shall bring or cause to be brought such as aforesaid servants at or before, I don't know what the third court is, but the court in their respective counties, to the end that the said court may judge of their age, which shall be entered into a book of record to be kept for that purpose. And the clerk of the court shall have 3 pounds of tobacco, tobacco being the major marketable produce that was used as a financial commodity at that time, for every such entry. And in case of either party find himself aggrieved at such determination, they or either of them shall have liberty all the time of such service to procure a sufficient certificate of such person's age, who shall serve according to such certificate. So this is specifically saying that if you're saying I was actually 18 years of age, you could only have indentured me for 4 years. So you indentured me for 6 years, but that's if I had been 16. So then there had to have been, or hopefully there would have been a point when this stowaway came to the court and it was affirmed through the court, through the judge, that yes, you were 18 years of age. You should have only had him indentured for 4 years and not 6 years. So now this is something I just read, probably, if not today, yesterday, and I realized, so that's what this is about. It's not just about the terms, and it's not just about what you would get after your period of time is over, but it's about, it's important that my age is specifically entered so that I am not unjustly indentured. And think in so many terms, so many times we hear about enslaved people who had no idea what their ages were because they just don't ever know. And they did not have this situation. It was something where the owners or the masters would approximate how old they were, maybe based on the fact that when they were born on their plantation. Here it is that legally you could have your age determined before a court, because what would bind you to a position was based on your age that would limit the time you were there, unless, of course, something happened where you didn't fulfill your term and it could be repeated over and over again. And there was no expiration to how many times it could be repeated over and over again. Now, at the beginning, this last paragraph, as it specifically says, that all servants at the expiration of their, and it even says several times, of service, if there be no other agreement besides their old clothes, shall be allowed 1 cloth suit, 1 pair of canvas drawers, 1 pair of shoes and stockings, 1 new hat or cap. If he hath not one sufficient at the present, shall falling axe, 1 weeding hoe, 2 shirts, and 3 barrels of corn. So again, they are receiving materials to help them toil the land that they are owed because they did go into this indentured servitude. This is just an example of our website, what you can use in the legacy of slavery to try to find, if you want to find incidences of persons who are indentured, enslaved, or if there's a family name that you want to look for as well, then you put in that family name where it says search, not necessarily search up here. There's a page right before this, but it should have said, but right where it says database, and you would put in that surname and you could find it. Or if you're looking for Anne Arundel County, you could put in Anne Arundel County. And there's the different types of records that we have entered. We have, as my great bio said, 400,000 of entries here. Runaway ads, 350 runaway ads, manumissions 2, certificates of freedom 21, 6 references of the census record between 1870 and 1880, and 9 references to slave jails. I think I don't remember exactly what term I used. I think I used indentured because of what's going to be showing lately, and to see just what type of responses or what type of entries do we have. And next slide. Here's an instance of a 12-year-old indentured servant. He's not named Robert Gavin. That's what you're going to see in the next slide. But anyway, this is the $5 reward. Left the subscribers employed without provocation. Interesting. Without provocation, what does that mean? A mulatto boy named Jonathan G. Higgins, about 12 or 13 years of age, about 4 feet high, had on when he left me a roundabout olive coat, velvet collar, black pair of cloth pantaloons, yarn stockings, and a pair of quarter boots, nearly worn out. The said boy was bound to me, so indentured or bound to me for 10 years, a term of 10 years, by the judges of the City Court of Baltimore. He has served me not quite 2 months. He was seen this morning on board of the Kentucky steamboat while lying at the wharf, previous to the boat leaving here for Baltimore. The boy has a mother living in Pratt Street, Baltimore, and it is more than probable he is with her. I believe her name is Rebecca Higgins. I shall certainly claim damages of the proprietors of the Steamboat Kentucky unless the boy is restored to me clear of all costs and charges. Edward Du Bois. So I think this is so interesting in many terms. For one, from a genealogical point of view, it gives a lot of information, which I think is great. The boy's name, the name of his mother, the fact that, not sure, but the fact that it says he was bound for me for a term of 10 years by the judges of the City Court of Baltimore, which makes me think that maybe this wasn't an agreement that he made with Rebecca, because he says, I believe her name is Rebecca Higgins. Maybe he was someone who was, if we'll just take it at face value, hanging out. He's 12, he's 13 years old. He likes to hang out by the boats, so he's there. Maybe he's upset with his mother. Maybe he's run away. Whatever reason, they gathered him, in a nice word, and he perhaps did not claim his mother, did not claim anything, and so he was bound to Edward Du Bois, who may have been saying, "Well, I would like somebody to work for me. I would benefit from having an indentured servant," bound to him, and then of that matter, perhaps he then subsequently starts saying that, "Well, my mother is named Rebecca Higgins. She lives in this area," and Edward Du Bois is aware of that as well, and wonders if she has encouraged him to do this, or if she's somewhere involved in some way. And at the same time, he's also saying that if he thinks that the Steamboat Kentucky is aware of this, and maybe they wanted him to be someone who is virtually free labor, some young man to work the boat, that he's going to claim damages from them if they don't give him back, free of any kind of further inconvenience to Edward Du Bois. Now, in the next slide, as it says, in the mulatto boy, in the next slide, what I did was I just Googled online this Robert Gavin. What I do sometimes is this to try to, again, make this more of a living, not necessarily this presentation, but all my presentations about persons who were so many centuries ago. We have no idea who they really were. We have no idea what they look like. We don't have cameras. We don't have sketches. These people are not renowned enough to have portraits. Is that I will use the descriptive terms that were placed in the ads and put them in Google, simply in Google, and I will just search for those. So in searching for those, this image came up of a young mulatto boy done by the portraiture of a Robert Gavin. Of course, in no way do I think this is actually the young man who we just found, but just to remind people when we're seeing all this text and seeing all this narrative that we really are talking about people. And in this case, we're not even talking about a full grown person. We're talking about a little 12 or 13-year-old boy. And for those of us who are here, whether it's our children, our grandchildren, our nieces or nephews, we can just imagine how precocious or whatever a 12 or 13-year-old boy might be. So now just some examples of some of the indentured servitude, some of the ads, again, to bringing people to life. 1805, $2 reward. Ran away from the subscriber, an apprentice boy by the name of Elijah McCauley. Whoever brings home said apprentice shall receive the above reward, by Isaac Berry. 1807, 6 cents reward. Ran away from the subscriber sometime earlier in October last, Sarah White, who was bound to her by the orphan's court. She is about 12 or 13 years of age. Whoever will secure the said girl so that I get her again shall receive the above reward. And if brought home to the subscriber living in Baltimore, all reasonable expenses will be paid. And also to show Mary A. Jones. Wasn't always men who were the owners or the masters of some of these enslaved or indentured servants. And also, many times it was women. It was little girls who were found running away as well as men. In this ad, it's 3 different individuals. The third line you'll see it's a James Lindley, again, went away last night from Patuxent Ironworks. The 2 following servant men, James Lindley, about 22 years of age, born in Ireland, a lusty, well-made fellow, about 5 feet 10 inches, light gray eyes and black hair, had on and took with him 2 cotton jackets, 2 on-a-brig, he was packed, 2 cotton jackets, 2 on-a-brig shirts, 1 pair of cotton breeches, 1 pair of on-a-brig trousers, a felt hat, old shoes. Thomas Sutton, about 25 years of age, born in England, a lusty, well-made fellow, about 6 feet high, gray eyes, short brown hair, had on and took with him an old castor hat, 2 cotton jackets, 2 on-a-brig shirts, a pair of brown roll trousers, and an old shoes. It is supposed there is a Negro man named Jacob, about 24 years of age with them, as he is missing out of the neighborhood. He is a well-made fellow, about 5 feet 4 inches high, of yellowish complexion and bushy hair. The under part of both his ears are cut off. Whoever takes up and secures the said servants and Negro, so that their masters may have them again, shall receive, if 20 miles from home, 30 shillings, if 30 miles, 40 shillings, and if out of the province, 3 pounds for each. A Samuel, John, and H. Snowden. So here are 3 individuals who of differing, I believe, of differing situations who have run away together. Because I cannot, although I'm pretty secure in the phrasing there that James Lindley and Thomas Sutton are both indentured servants. I can't be sure that the Negro man Jacob is, because he's not saying that. Or at the very least, if, as it says, so that their masters may have them again, they're different masters. So my thinking is that James Lindley and Thomas Sutton are probably indentured to one person, and Jacob, if he's indentured or if he's enslaved, is to someone else. But for whatever reason, they ran away together, and this is a very specific pairing and descriptions which could have them recaptured again for those variable rewards that are offered for them. Now, just a few more specificities about this. 1638 and 1658 laws. Now, again, we're going way back to the beginning of indentured servitude to show you how the differences became in 1664, but what was already in place for everyone who could have been indentured before slavery became codified for those of African descent. 1638. The gist of this one is that both masters and servants can be penalized for bad behavior, or as we call it now, for bad actors. Servants refusing to perform the lawful commands of their masters or mistresses, or their assigner or overseer, or offending, I'm skipping some, or offending any other wise against their duty or indentured, and the servant so offending shall be publicly whipped or otherwise corrected at the discretion of the judge, working in servile labor upon the Lord's day or other holy days published aforesaid, and in the church to be kept as holy without case of necessity. Then this is going on and on and on. But also, that's about the person who was indentured. One line or two lines before that, below that, it says, to be allowed by the judge and master or mistress or other. In other words, if somehow the master or mistress has allowed this, or they didn't stop this from happening, this misbehavior, then it's saying that the master or mistress of or other free man offending therein shall forfeit 30 pounds of tobacco or 5 shillings sterling for his own default, and 30 pounds of tobacco or 5 shillings sterling more for the fault of every of his servants offending by his command or consent. And I'm not sure what it's saying, or eating flesh in time of Lent or on other days. I'm not really sure what that's about. But it's just saying that in this situation, they both could be penalized. Certainly the indentured servant would be penalized more severely, but even at a cost to the master or mistress. Concerning those who are illegitimate, as we saw earlier on, you could have your children indentured if you had an illegitimate child. Whereas diverse women servants within a province not having children, not having husbands living with them, have been gotten with child in the time of their servitude, to the great dishonor of God and apparent damage to the masters or owners of such servants, and no law yet shall provide what that damage shall be recoverable. Skipping, that every such mother of a bastard child shall not able sufficiently to prove that party child to be the begetter of such child. In every such case, the mother of such child shall only be liable to satisfy the damages so sustained by servitude. So this is, I feel, very complicated and certainly very weighted against the woman. In other words, it's saying that if somebody begot her with child and she can't prove who that person is, then it's for her to do recompense by the way of servitude. Assuming that she doesn't have money to pay whatever penalty would be, then she would serve that person who was losing the benefit of her, I guess, her motherless situation of productivity. She would be the one who would be penalized for this situation. Then the party charged, if a servant satisfy half the said damages, if a freeman, then the whole damages by servitude or otherwise as aforesaid. And at the bottom, that then he shall perform his promise to her or recompense her abuse, as a court before whom such matter is brought shall see convenient, the quality and condition of. So if they do find the person, or if they do get proof or somehow adjudicate some proof, then she can be approximately, I'd say, I'm going to say off the hook to be very colloquial about it, if the husband will come forward and say, yes, I'm the one, yes, I'm the father, and I will pay you damages to whatever degree you're saying this is worth. Very much not what the situation would be for an enslaved person. There would be none of that kind of, we can make an agreement, none whatsoever. 1715, another situation where they're trying to get the powers that be, the owners, the masters, what have you, to get the agreement, the assistance of others if they have persons who are running away from their indentured servitude or their slavery. They're in servitude situation. For the better discovery of and encouragement of our neighbor Indians to seize, apprehend, so it's saying size, we would say siege, apprehend or take up any runaway servants or slaves and bring them before magistrate, they shall, for a reward, have a match coat paid him or them, or the value thereof, which reward shall be paid and satisfied by the county, where such person shall be so apprehended, and such runaway, if not a slave, to reimburse the said county be servitude, and otherwise, as the justices of the provincial or county court shall think fit. So the way I read that is that if you're enslaved, then there'll be the penalty that goes toward the master. If you're indentured, then it would be your servitude, such as the different periods of time that you were indentured, would be the way that the Indian would be rewarded for bringing these persons back into their bound situation. In the bottom paragraph, it's basically talking about how they would make satisfaction by the court if a person was a runaway and had been caught by whoever the individual was. As it says here, which court shall secure such person or persons till he or they can make satisfaction to the party that shall so apprehend or seize. See, they say seize here, and the first time they didn't, well, whatever. Seize such runaways or other persons by this act is required, except such persons shall make satisfaction as aforesaid before such court shall happen. And that notice may be conveniently given to the master, mistress, dame, or overseer of runaways, taken up as aforesaid. The commissioners of the county shall aforesaid cause of note off of the runaway's name, so seized and apprehended as aforesaid, to be set up at the next adjacent county courts. Now, what I wanted to show in this next slide is just a level of the specific differences for the servant. So at the end, and this was also brought up a little bit earlier, but again, this is 1715, which was a major year of codification in Maryland. Furthermore, for ascertaining what each servant, according to the custom of country, shall have at the expiration of their servitude, that every man's servant shall, at such time of expiration of his servitude as aforesaid, have allowed and given him one new hat, a good suit, that is to say, coat and breeches, either of kersey or broadcloth, one new shift of white linen, one new pair of French fall shoes and stockings, 2 hose, 1 axe, and 1 gun of 20 shillings price, not above 4 foot by the barrel, nor less than 3.5, which said gun shall, by the master or mistress, in the presence of the next justice of the peace, be delivered to such free man, under the penalty of 500 pounds of tobacco on such master or mistress omitting to do so. So in other words, if this person who is indentured successfully, rightfully, justly fulfills their indentured servitude, and they're not given what this specifies here, the master or mistress so not doing could be penalized for not doing so for the enslaved. When any Negro shall be committed to the jail of any country as a runaway, and the notice required to be given by the sheriff shall have been given, and the time for his detention expired, and now no person shall have claimed said runaway and proved his title to the same, it shall be the duty of the sheriff forthwith to carry such slave before the judge of the circuit court. What this is basically saying is that if someone has run away, but maybe they're not really running away, maybe they are a free person, maybe they've received a certificate of freedom, maybe they're, such as I'm going to go into in just a moment, maybe they're like Benjamin Banneker, they were born free, but they're in an area where nobody knows them. So there's an amount of time where they can be, for want of a modern term, incarcerated or held or jailed until someone either comes forth to vouch for their freedom, or they could be sold into slavery. But this is allowing for the fact that there's a time limit before that can take place. At the bottom it says, and if no person shall claim such runaway within the time for which he may be remanded and prove his title, the said sheriff shall release such runaway, and in either case, when such runaway shall be discharged, the expense of keeping such runaway in confinement and publishing such notice shall be levied on the county. So if they find that the person is not actually a runaway enslaved person, then they can choose to free them, and the county itself would incur that cost of jailing them. Because otherwise, if the person is a runaway and the master claims them, the jailer would say, okay, well, we held this person for this amount of time. You owe us this amount of money for housing your human property. Now, let me see here. So, Benjamin Banneker, just as an example of a free person. Benjamin Banneker's grandmother was an indentured servant named Molly, who married an enslaved African named Banneker. That's where the name was derived. So since she is free after her servitude ends, she frees her husband, so the child they have named Mary is free-born. Since she's free-born and she's the mother of Benjamin Banneker is a free-born person. He is someone who would never have needed a manumission. He would have needed a certificate of freedom to prove that he was a free-born person. I've never seen this book, but I did look online just to see if, as far as children, if they wanted to read up on her, because this talks about both situations, an indentured servant, which is what his grandmother was, and also the fact that she ended up marrying a slave person and gave birth to a free person. So I think this would be a very interesting book if you wanted to explore this with a younger person, to see just what the differences between enslavement and indentured servitude was. If you're by any chance looking to do research about settlers back at the beginning of Maryland colonization, this is a resource we have at the Maryland State Archives, The New Early Settlers of Maryland. It was done by a volunteer of ours, Dr. Carson Gibb, who added, I think I have it in the next slide, thousands of new entries into it, which will help you identify these individuals, approximately when they arrived here, if at all possible, perhaps the ships they were on, that they arrived on. It's just an invaluable resource. And also it talks about 34,000, or it has 34,326 possible entries from the earlier edition. Gus Gordis, who was the deputy state archivist, I think like 50 some years ago. And next slide, please. And that was the set. Well, you can just Google it. I know I had the website there too. So just a very overview of it. During the first years of this province of Maryland, 1633-1681, Lord Baltimore rewarded people who transported themselves or others with rights to land, as we talked about before, 50 acres per head right. Second paragraph. From these records, lists of settlers have been made since early in the 19th century, but only in 1968 was one published. This was Gus Gordis's The Early Settlers of Maryland, immediately a cornerstone of genealogy. In 1997, a supplement corrected and enlarged the early settlers, and that was one by Carson Gibb. In 1975, Russell Menard wrote that the quote-unquote best estimate of immigration to Maryland between 1634 and 1681 is 32,000. The new settlers has about 34,000 entries, which, allowing for duplications, is close to that estimate. So if you have any thoughts, any rumors, or whatever, that could be where your ancestors' origins lie. And this is what ended slavery for Maryland's enslaved community. November 1st, 1864 is the anniversary. This year is the 160th anniversary of the 1864 Maryland Constitution. This is Article 24, which freed all persons of African descent who were enslaved at that time, which is approximately 87,000 139. I looked it up this moment ago. I'm not like that. That hereafter in this state there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment of a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, and all persons held to service or labor as slaves are hereby declared free. This is a chart of the census records or the census returns for 1860, right before the Civil War, and also prior to the 1864 Constitution. And that's where you see that at that time, we were almost a 50-50 state for free and enslaved persons of African descent. 83,942 individuals were free, 87,000, okay, I was off by like 40, 87,189 were enslaved. And if you're looking at your county, which is to say our county, Anne Arundel County, you see their total population is the second line, 23,900. Total enslaved population, 7,332. So roughly a third of the population was enslaved, and free 4,864 in 1860. 1860. 1860. And this is this next one is just a quick fast and in a hurry, because there's another presentation I do about what do you really know about slavery, which I did for, I think it was Historic Annapolis some years, or maybe just last year, which I do for children too, because there's some myths or some things that people just think, but they're not right. So I just want to get some of the basic ones out there. Was Maryland a slave state? As I said, my gastroenterologist, after I gave my copay, yep. Yes, officially from 1664 to November 1st, 1864, and the passage of the Maryland Constitution, race-based slavery was legal. Did Harriet Tubman conduct 19 rescues in which she freed 300 people from slavery? Have people heard that number before? Have you all heard that number? No? Okay. I've heard it many times before, and there was even I've gone over to the Eastern Shore to different events there, and there are these two lovely young ladies who I think were just teenagers, and they were singing this little rhyme, and they said 19 rescues and 300 individuals. There's no history to actually support that. It's more like it was, as it says here, research still continues, but evidence indicates that Harriet Tubman conducted 8 to 13 rescues, which directly freed approximately 70 or more persons. And as you see in the next line, where were Harriet Tubman's rescues? All of her rescues were conducted in Maryland. Primarily, she was rescuing persons who were either of her family or people that she knew of vis-a-vis her family or other members or people that she knew of. She did help within the Underground Railroad, give advice to others outside of that, but specifically, she was involved in rescues in Maryland. When I was growing up, I totally did not think that. I thought she was rescuing people all over the United States of America. I just did not know. Now, we all know the answer to the next one. Were white people enslaved in Maryland? White, black, and indigenous people were all subject to indentured servitude in Maryland from the time of the initial arrival of the Ark and the Dove. Only persons of African descent, however, were ever legally condemned to slavery. Was slavery in Maryland less harsh than in other parts of America? Slavery in Maryland could be as brutal as in any other region of the Americas. Treatment was subject to the whims of the owner. Was it illegal in Maryland for enslaved people to write? Many people will say that is the truth here, and that is the truth in other southern states. I think it is the truth in, I think, South Carolina and Virginia. I think there actually were codified laws that restricted enslaved persons, and I think black persons, to read and write. That is not the case in Maryland. There was no legislation which specifically prohibited enslaved people to read and write. It was, however, strongly discouraged. One could say it's one of those things, it's one of those things that's what you act on, even though it's not actually law. That's what the persons who were in power acted upon. Samuel Green was arrested for knowingly having in his possession, because this is the instance that usually comes up when people try to say this is a situation. Was arrested for knowingly having in his possession a certain abolition pamphlet called, quote unquote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, not for having the ability to read the book. After its discovery, Frederick Douglass's owner's wife was forbidden by her husband to continue teaching the enslaved child to read and write. Now, that's not after having him read Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was after finding out that he could read. So I know I put those two sentences together. It's like, oh, was he reading that? No. He escaped before that. Douglass had already retained enough knowledge to spark his interest and eventually became renowned for his literary and oratory skills. Was interracial marriage considered illegal in Maryland? As we know, it very much was. Maryland, marriage and the bearing of mixed-race children was illegal and incurred serious punishments until the law was repealed in 1967. Was cotton the main crop sold everywhere slavery existed? Tobacco, not cotton, was the main crop sold in Maryland. In the early years of settlement, tobacco was virtually a source of commerce and a barter in exchange for services, and penalties for crimes were assessed in pounds. Were all enslaved people freed with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation? As I just said, no. Legalized slavery in Maryland did not end until the passage of the 1864 Maryland Constitution, which took effect on November 1st, 1864. All enslaved African Americans were not free until that date in Maryland. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed those persons who were in those states currently under rebellion. The Washington, D.C. freed those persons who were enslaved in April 16, 1862. So there's different years for that. And if you want to get an overview of all this,